They laughed when Caleb Mercer asked to keep the burned engines. They called the single father a fool, said he was trading his daughter's future for scrap metal nobody else wanted. Caleb said nothing. He pulled the tarp off a hidden machine he had built in secret for 4 years, connected the fuel line and rested his hand on the switch. That was the moment Claire Whitaker walked in. Her chief engineer went pale beside her. He recognized what stood in front of him, and he understood in that instant that if the engine started, everything he had buried for 7 years would surface with it. What the men at the scrapyard mocked as junk was about to answer for every engine Whitaker Industrial Power had ever built. The heat at Dugan Marine and Diesel Repair pressed down heavy that afternoon, the kind of Louisiana heat that made the metal too hot to touch and the air taste like rust. A flatbed rolled in from the recycling contractor carrying 8 dead diesel engines, their blocks blackened and cracked, headed for the crusher before sundown. 2 had come from a fish house cooler that failed during a heat wave. 1 had drowned when a shrimp boat took on water faster than the pumps could clear it. 3 were industrial pump motors pulled from a levee station. The last 2 wore the stenciled serial numbers of a Whitaker recall program nobody in town liked to talk about. Caleb was under a transmission 30 feet away when he saw the crack pattern on one of the blocks and set his wrench down without finishing the bolt. He walked the row slowly, running 2 fingers along seams the other men would never have looked at twice, reading the scorch marks the way another man might read handwriting. 4 of those blocks carried failure patterns his collection back home did not yet have, and he wanted them before the crusher did. He asked Patrick Dugan if he could take 4 of the engines home. Patrick, wiping his hands on a shop rag, asked how Caleb intended to pay for something that was technically already sold to the scrapyard. Caleb offered 3 night shifts on the boat repairs, nobody wanted to stay late for, plus a weekend on call. Patrick studied him for a moment, then shrugged and said the paperwork wouldn't miss 4 blocks nobody was counting closely. The other mechanics didn't let it go that easily. One of them said Caleb ought to sell the pile of junk sitting behind his rented house and put the money toward a truck that actually ran. Another one, a younger man named Dale, brought up Grace, said a good father spent his money on his daughter instead of dead machines that would never earn him a dime. Caleb didn't argue. He only asked Patrick to confirm, out loud, that none of the 4 blocks were still needed for any safety purpose, and when Patrick agreed, Caleb began marking them with chalk. That was when the Whitaker convoy pulled into the lot. Claire Whitaker climbed down from the lead vehicle in a navy dress cut clean at the collar, her hair loose around her shoulders, her manner sharp enough that nobody mistook her for anything but the person in charge. She had come to Port Marlow herself because engines carrying her family's name were failing up and down the coast, and she wanted to see the wreckage before anyone had a chance to explain it away. Clinton Dane walked a step behind her, his jacket pressed despite the heat, his eyes already moving across the lot like a man taking inventory of a threat. Claire noticed Caleb before she noticed anything else, because he was the only man in the yard who hadn't turned to look at the executives arriving. He was still bent over one of the chalked blocks, tracing a hairline crack with his thumb. Clinton saw the stenciled code first, X17. He froze mid-stride, then ordered the crew to stop moving that particular block immediately, calling it Whitaker testing property that had been misrouted out of a secure inventory. Caleb didn't argue ownership. He only asked why a supposedly secure testing block had ended up stacked with engines already marked for destruction. Clinton told the crew to cover it. Caleb managed to snap one photograph of the crack running along the main oil gallery before the tarp went over it, and he said quietly, but not quietly enough that Claire missed it, that the crack hadn't started that day. Claire looked at Clinton. Clinton looked away. Later that night, in the privacy of his own kitchen, Caleb blew the photograph up on an old laptop and matched it against a report he had written 7 years earlier, one that warned Whitaker's design would fail in that exact location under sustained heat. He had been right then. He was looking at proof that nobody had listened. He sat with that thought longer than he meant to, the kitchen light humming overhead, the photograph glowing on the cracked screen. It wasn't satisfaction he felt. It was something closer to grief, the particular kind that comes from watching a warning you gave years ago finally arrive, too late to matter to the people who needed it most. He printed the image anyway, filed it beside the others, and told himself the same thing he had told himself for 4 years straight. Somebody had to keep the record, even if nobody asked to see it. Caleb lived in a small rented house 2 streets back from the harbor, close enough that he could hear the shrimp boats idling before dawn. Behind the house stood an old storage barn he had reinforced himself, board by board, until it could carry the weight of engine blocks, lift chains, and a workbench he had built from salvaged steel. By day he worked for Patrick, repairing boat engines, cargo trucks, drainage pumps, and the generators that kept small shops running during power outages. He had a reputation for being able to listen to a failing engine and name the problem before he ever opened the hood, but he was also known for taking jobs that barely covered the parts, because he couldn't bring himself to turn away a man who needed his equipment working and had nowhere else to go. Patrick thought Caleb was too generous for his own good. Caleb thought a man who couldn't afford a new machine still deserved to have the one he owned running properly. At dinner that evening, Grace sat across from her father, 7 years old, and quiet children get when they're hiding something. She had folded a notice about a school activity fee into a small square and tucked it under her placemat, hoping he wouldn't see it before the deadline passed and the problem simply disappeared on its own. Caleb found it anyway. He didn't say a word about the money he had been saving for a new sensor kit. He simply put it in an envelope with Grace's name on it and set it by her backpack, and when she noticed, he told her it wasn't a big deal, because to him it wasn't. After Grace went to bed, Caleb walked out to the barn, and for the first time the story showed what the scrap pile actually was. It wasn't chaos. Every part sat labeled on a shelf, cataloged by origin and failure type, cross-referenced in a notebook filled with his own careful handwriting. A burned piston carried a tag noting it had come from a generator run on degraded fuel for years without maintenance. A worn bearing was marked as failing from delayed oil delivery under sudden load. A corroded cylinder head, salt-streaked and pitted, had come off a boat that spent its life in brackish water. Caleb used a magnifying loupe, a set of calipers, and page after page of notes to compare one failure against another, building a picture no laboratory test could have given him, because laboratories didn't run their engines for 5,000 hours in real weather with real neglect. Grace appeared in the doorway just long enough to snap a photograph of her father standing beside a large covered shape near the back wall, something she wanted for a school project about her family. Caleb told her gently to get back to bed, and she went, leaving him alone with the machine again. The barn smelled of cut oil and old metal, a smell Caleb had stopped noticing years ago the way a person stops noticing their own house. Rain had come through the tin roof once, 2 winters back, and he had patched it himself rather than spend money he didn't have on a contractor, and the patch still held. On the far wall hung a corkboard covered in photographs of failure points, arranged not by engine but by pattern, so that a crack from a shrimp boat sat pinned beside a crack from a levee pump, both circled in the same red marker because they told the same story about where metal gave way first. It was, in its own quiet fashion, the most organized room in Port Marlow, even if the only person who ever saw it that way was the man who built it. In an earlier season of his life, Caleb had been a young engineer inside Whitaker Industrial Power, hired for his instinct with combustion and heat. He had identified that the company's standard block design distributed thermal stress unevenly and proposed 3 fixes: thicker walls around the primary oil gallery, a secondary oil line to a chronically starved region, and injection timing that adjusted with temperature instead of staying fixed. Clinton, then rising fast through the engineering ranks, called the changes too expensive and told Caleb to focus on simpler assignments. When Caleb's wife, Amelia, died not long after, he left the company to raise their daughter alone, believing his research had died with his position. He never learned that Clinton had quietly taken the work, stripped Caleb's name from it, and used the resulting report to climb into a leadership seat he still held. Caleb opened a drawer that night and pulled out the original folder of hand-drawn schematics, the ones that had become the bones of the machine under the tarp. On the cover, in Amelia's handwriting, was a line she had written to him years earlier, half joking and half serious. "The most important equipment has to keep working in places no one comes to fix it." He read it, closed the folder, and went back to comparing the crack in the photograph of X-17 against 5 other Whitaker engines from the same production run. Every one of them had failed in the same place. Whitaker's lawyers confirmed the following week that X-17 had indeed been misrouted testing property, and the company was within its rights to reclaim it. Caleb didn't dispute that. He only asked that the crack data be preserved before the block was destroyed. Clinton refused, saying all records generated from company assets belonged to Whitaker alone. A letter arrived at Caleb's house 2 days later, not demanding the surrender of every scrap piece he owned, but accusing him of building a device that might rely on trade secrets he had been exposed to during his time at the company. That single letter did more damage than any outright seizure could have. Independent test facilities began declining to schedule Caleb's prototype. Investors who had expressed interest stopped returning calls. His patent filing stalled under review. Patrick worried aloud that his small shop could be dragged into a lawsuit it couldn't survive, and he told Caleb, not unkindly, that maybe it was time to put the project away for good. Caleb looked at his bills that night and realized that if this went to court, he could lose the roof over Grace's head before it was ever resolved. Claire came to see him herself, without an entourage, her tone still guarded. She asked directly whether he had carried any Whitaker data with him when he left the company. Caleb answered by laying out everything he had: a notebook with dates that began only after his resignation, receipts for every material he had purchased with his own money, machining records, testing photographs, and a catalog of scrap sourced from independent suppliers with no connection to Whitaker at all. He admitted the underlying thermal principle had first occurred to him while he still worked there, but every meaningful component built since then belonged to the 4 years that followed, built on his own time in his own barn. Claire asked him to hand the full design over to Clinton for review. Caleb refused, telling her that a man who had accused him couldn't also be the one who decided whether he was guilty. He proposed an independent panel instead. He would open his files if Whitaker opened its own records on the design changes connected to X-17. Claire agreed, believing transparency would protect the company more than secrecy ever could. Clinton objected, but he couldn't explain, not convincingly, why an independent review frightened him so badly if there was nothing in the old files worth hiding. Claire returned days later with 2 independent engineers, an intellectual property attorney, and Clinton at her side, expecting to find a dangerous jumble of salvaged parts assembled without discipline. Instead, she found order. Caleb walked them through the barn shelf by shelf, separating research components from fixtures and from the parts actually machined for the working prototype, every load-bearing piece backed by a material certification. When one of the engineers asked why he hadn't simply purchased manufacturer test data instead of collecting failures himself, Caleb explained that factory reports usually stopped the moment a product passed its test. The broken engines showed him what happened after 5,000 real hours in the field, which was the part nobody wrote down. He led them to the machine at the back of the barn and pulled the tarp away for the first time in front of outsiders, revealing what he had built and naming it after his late wife. He explained it in plain terms: a secondary combustion chamber that helped fuel burn evenly even when quality varied, a new oil path that protected the exact region that kept cracking on Whitaker's own engines, a 2-stage filtration and moisture separator that let the machine tolerate degraded fuel sitting unused for months, and a mechanical governor that would take over at reduced power if the electronic sensors ever failed. Claire asked why any of it mattered. Caleb pointed toward the harbor and told her that a generator failing in a laboratory only ruins a test. A pump failing in the middle of a storm can put water into somebody's living room. One of the engineers, a woman named Diane who had spent 20 years testing marine diesels, crouched beside the mechanical governor and asked how Caleb had arrived at the failsafe ratio without access to a proper test bench. He told her he'd built a smaller bench himself, out of a salvaged dynamometer and a pump motor he'd rewired over 2 winters, and that most of the calibration had come from running the governor to failure again and again until it stopped surprising him. Diane didn't say anything for a moment. She only wrote something down in her own notebook and moved on to the next component, but the silence carried its own kind of respect. Clinton laughed off the demonstration, calling it a workshop curiosity dressed up as heroism. Caleb didn't rise to it. He only said that the men in that room studied how engines were built, while he had spent 4 years studying how they died. The engineers agreed the device contained enough original engineering to merit an independent trial, and Claire proposed using the testing facility at the Port Marlow Technical College. If the machine failed because of a design flaw or proved to rely on stolen data, Caleb would have to stop the project during the dispute. If it worked and the results held up under scrutiny, Whitaker would have to withdraw its attempt to block the testing altogether. Clinton agreed to the terms, and as he turned to leave, his eyes caught the timing wheel Caleb had hand-cut for the injection system, marked with a small crescent notch he had filed himself. Clinton understood exactly what that notch controlled, and he understood that shifting it by only a few degrees could make the engine run perfectly cold and misfire violently once it warmed. Caleb had 7 days before the scheduled trial. His daytime hours still belonged to Patrick's shop because he couldn't afford to give up the income. So the finishing work on the prototype happened at night, hour after hour, installing a pressure relief valve, A backup thermal sensor, a dedicated oil line, the mechanical governor, and an emergency shutdown he tested more times than seemed necessary to anyone but him. He photographed every fitting, marked every critical bolt with paint, and logged every measurement in the same careful hand he used for his scrap catalog. Patrick began to notice, almost against his will, that the man he had dismissed as a dreamer double-checked every detail and refused to let a single small error pass uncorrected. One night, he found Caleb retorquing a bolt he had already torqued that same evening, simply because the number in his notebook didn't match the number on the wrench to the decimal he wanted, and Patrick stood in the doorway a long moment before saying anything at all, unsure what to do with the discomfort of being wrong about a man he'd known for years. Grace's teacher sent home a note that week asking whether Caleb could come speak to the class about his work as a mechanic. And for one evening the barn went dark and quiet while he sat at a school desk built for someone half his size, describing what it felt like to listen to an engine the way other people listen to a heartbeat. He didn't mention the machine under the tarp. That part of his life still belonged only to the barn, to the notebook, and to the 4 years he had spent convinced no one else needed to know about it yet. When the prototype was delivered to the technical college, the insurance carrier required a certified technician to install the monitoring equipment and a protective containment cage, and by policy Caleb wasn't permitted inside the room during calibration. Clinton nominated a technician named Kevin Price for the job, a man with a legitimate reason to open the sensor housing and a personal debt hanging over him after a prior safety violation Clinton had quietly agreed not to report. Kevin removed the hand-cut timing wheel and replaced it with one that looked nearly identical, shifted 4.5 degrees off true, an error small enough to stay hidden while the engine ran cold and dangerous enough to misfire once the block reached operating temperature. He sealed the housing with an official Whitaker calibration sticker and logged the job at 4 minutes, though the overhead camera later showed the sensor assembly sitting open on the bench for 17 minutes, far longer than the task required. Caleb checked the primary bolts himself before the trial and found his paint marks undisturbed, since Kevin had never touched them, and he trusted the intact calibration seal without any reason yet to doubt it. The night before the test he sat alone beside the machine, listening to a short voicemail Grace had left wishing him luck, and rested his hand on the small nameplate bearing his late wife's name. This was never about becoming wealthy. He only wanted to prove that old equipment could be made better instead of being thrown away and replaced at enormous cost. In the morning he checked every part within his reach one final time, all of it exactly as he had left it, unaware that the danger had already walked in through a door the safety procedures themselves had opened. The trial took place inside a containment room with impact-resistant glass, a steel cage, and an automatic fire suppression system. Grace was not present. Caleb ran through his checklist of oil pressure, coolant temperature, fuel integrity, the emergency shutdown, and the fire suppression trigger before he pressed the start button, and the engine turned over twice before catching, settling into a low, steady, even rhythm that filled the room. For the first 5 minutes the results looked strong, fuel consumption running about 12% below the comparison engine, cylinder temperatures balanced across the block, low-end torque outperforming expectations, and no abnormal knock in the sound. Patrick, watching from behind the glass, felt his doubts begin to loosen. Claire glanced at Clinton and noticed he wasn't sharing in the room's growing relief, even though a stranger's invention was quietly proving useful to his own company. Clinton pushed to raise the load to 70%. Caleb agreed but asked that they not extend the run beyond the previously agreed limit. Clinton leaned on the panel chair, arguing that an invention meant to survive harsh conditions should be tested under real stress, not coddled. As the temperature climbed, the mistimed wheel began doing exactly what it had been altered to do. Caleb watched the pressure reading on cylinder 3 begin to swing and called for the load to be reduced immediately. Clinton insisted the numbers hadn't crossed the stated limit and suggested, in front of the room, that Caleb was trying to hide a weakness in his own design. A second later, the fuel ignited at the wrong moment in the cycle. A dry, sharp bang cracked through the containment room. The intake cover blew loose, a brief flare of fire licked up before the suppression system smothered it, and though nobody was hurt, the trial was over. For a full second nobody moved. The suppression system hissed white powder across the cage, the smell of scorched metal filling the small room, and Caleb stood with his hands still hovering near the emergency shutdown he hadn't needed to reach, because the system had done exactly what it was built to do. That, at least, had worked. Nothing else in that moment felt like it had. Clinton immediately called the device a dangerous contraption thrown together in a home workshop out of scrap metal, and within hours a leaked video clip circulated showing only the explosion, the fire, and Caleb standing frozen in front of it. Claire had no choice but to suspend the testing program. Patrick told Caleb gently but firmly that he couldn't bring the prototype back to the shop since customers were already canceling appointments over what they'd seen online. Caleb hauled the machine home in silence, unable to understand how 4 years of careful data had failed him in a single afternoon. He backed the trailer into the barn well after midnight, left the tarp off out of some stubborn refusal to hide from what had happened, and sat on an overturned bucket staring at the block until the sky outside the small window began to lighten. He went over every reading in his notebook twice, then a third time, looking for the mistake he was certain had to be his own, because the alternative, that someone had reached inside his work and turned it against him, wasn't a thought he was ready to let in yet. That night, Grace appeared for the second time, and for the last extended scene before the story's final act. She set the photograph she had taken weeks earlier on the kitchen table and told her father she still wanted to use it for her school presentation about him. Caleb looked at the image and noticed the small crescent notch on the timing wheel, clearly visible in the photograph. He compared it against the part now sitting in his workshop. The notch was gone. Grace went off to bed, and Caleb set the two pieces side by side, finally understanding that Amelia had not failed on its own. The photograph alone wouldn't convict anyone, but it turned what looked like a technical failure into what looked, increasingly, like a crime scene. Caleb didn't accuse Clinton publicly, and he didn't blame anyone out loud. He understood that a man who had just failed spectacularly and then immediately claimed sabotage would struggle to be believed by anyone. Instead, he invited an independent engineer to witness the disassembly of the sensor housing. Together they found that the replacement timing wheel carried no trace of Caleb's own machining marks, that its alloy matched an internal Whittaker production batch, that its surface carried a preservation oil used only in calibration rooms, that the teeth had been shifted exactly 4.5 degrees, and that there was no natural wear pattern anywhere on the part. Caleb sent the findings to Claire without demanding anything in return. Claire kept her distance at first, unwilling to convert suspicion into accusation without more to stand on, but as she studied the data, one detail stopped her cold. If Caleb's combustion chamber had a genuine design flaw, the failure should have shown up immediately, not 5 minutes in, after the engine had already run clean and stable. She requested the camera logs from the testing facility, and although the footage never clearly showed the swap, since Kevin had angled himself to block the view, the timestamps didn't match his written report. The calibration sticker also came from a roll issued exclusively to Whittaker's own facility, never to the technical college. When Claire checked internal communications, she found that Clinton had ordered the communications department to draft a statement about a dangerous homemade device 2 full days before the trial had even taken place, and the statement described the failure almost exactly as it had occurred. Claire went to Caleb and admitted, without hedging, that she had signed the legal letter against him before verifying the full picture herself. Caleb didn't soften right away. He set his own conditions. The evidence had to be backed up somewhere outside Whittaker's own servers. An independent attorney had to oversee the process. Claire could not use any part of Amelia's design without his consent, and every future communication between them had to be documented. Claire accepted all of it. It was in that same hour that Henry Briggs reached out, having watched the leaked video and recognized the combustion chamber design immediately, telling her he had seen that same structure years earlier in a report that once carried Caleb's name, before that name quietly disappeared from it. Henry led Caleb and Claire to an old records room inside a former Whittaker facility, where he explained that 7 years earlier Caleb had identified 3 serious flaws in the standard engine design. The board had dismissed the proposal at the time, but Clinton later took the underlying research for himself, and once Caleb left the company, Clinton became the only name anyone associated with it. Henry admitted he had known the truth the whole time and had said nothing, afraid that speaking up would cost him his position and shutter the testing lab he oversaw. His silence hadn't caused the sabotage directly, but it had allowed Clinton to believe, for years, that erasing another man's work carried no real consequence. Inside the boxes they found the original report bearing Caleb's name, a later version bearing Clinton's, a design change order, Henry's own buried warning memo, Clinton's signature approving thinner block walls to cut costs, and testing data that had clearly been cut short before completion. Claire understood, looking at the paperwork, that the current recall crisis traced directly back to that decision. Sensing the investigation closing in, Clinton called an emergency board session, played the leaked footage of the misfire for the room, and accused Claire of using company resources to help a former employee with a personal grudge against him. The board temporarily suspended her signing authority, ordering her to step back from Caleb entirely or face a formal vote to remove her from leadership altogether. The insurance carrier separately barred the prototype from returning to the original test facility. Clinton believed at that point that Caleb had run out of road. He hadn't counted on the Gulf Resilience Equipment Trial, an independent evaluation for generators and pumps meant to serve coastal communities during hurricane season, which Caleb had registered for weeks earlier. Claire could fund it privately with her own money, but doing so meant standing publicly against her own company's official position, a decision that would put her career on the line in a way no board vote could soften. Caleb asked her why she was willing to take that risk. She told him it wasn't because she believed in him out of sentiment. It was because she had seen the evidence and could no longer pretend not to know what it meant. The Gulf Resilience Equipment Trial took place at the county's emergency response staging ground, drawing independent engineers, fire department representatives, water rescue crews, port authority officials, a delegation from a coastal medical clinic, industrial equipment investors, and state certification inspectors. Grace was not present. Amelia was disassembled and inspected in front of the crowd, every component photographed, numbered, and sealed, with no single person allowed access to it alone. A standard Whittaker engine of matchings and splitsman stood beside it as the point of comparison. The testing sequence called for a cold start after prolonged exposure to heat and humidity, operation on fuel sitting near the edge of acceptable quality, sudden load changes, a deliberate disconnection of the primary sensor, and continuous running through heavy salt air and moisture. Clinton arrived with legal counsel, publicly declaring that Whittaker would accept no responsibility if the device caused an accident. Claire attended despite her suspended authority. Patrick and several of the mechanics who had once mocked Caleb's project stood behind the barrier watching. Caleb didn't give a speech. He checked the seals, the oil pressure, and the emergency shutdown one final time, and then he pressed the switch. A light rain had already started by the time the crowd settled into position, the sky the color of wet slate, and someone near the barrier muttered that it felt like bad timing for a machine that had already failed once in front of everybody. Caleb heard it. He didn't answer. He finished his checklist, nodded to the certifying inspector standing beside the comparison engine, and pressed the switch. The engine turned over once, twice, then Amelia caught, and the sound that filled the yard was low, even, and steady. In the opening stage, fuel consumption ran nearly 15% below the comparison engine. As the load increased, low-end torque came in roughly 18% stronger. The standard Whittaker engine performed well until the panel disconnected its primary pressure sensor, at which point its safety system shifted into protective mode and shut the machine down entirely. Amelia's output dropped to about 60%, but the mechanical governor kept it running. Caleb noticed the temperature on cylinder 3 begin to climb, and rather than hide it, he announced the reading out loud to the entire crowd and adjusted the oil valve in front of everyone watching. When an investor asked why he would admit to a weakness in real time, Caleb answered that a trustworthy machine wasn't one without problems. It was one that gave the person operating it enough time to fix the problem before it became a failure. Near the end of the trial, an early season storm rolled in faster than the forecast had predicted. A fallen line knocked out power to the staging area, and the site's own fixed backup generator started, then died almost immediately, failing at the exact weak point that had triggered the recall in the first place. Rainwater began pooling toward the low-lying equipment shelter, and the drainage pump and radio room dropped onto short-lived battery backup. The site coordinator asked whether Amelia could be connected to carry the load. Caleb warned that the prototype hadn't been certified for extended emergency use. The coordinator confirmed the decision belonged to the response authority on site, not to Whittaker. Claire didn't give Caleb an order either way. She told him the choice was his. Caleb connected Amelia to the drainage pump and the radio room. The engine strained under the sudden load, its rotation dropping for a few tense seconds before steadying out. The pump began pulling water away from the equipment shelter. The lights in the radio room came back on. Amelia carried that load for more than 2 hours until utility power was finally restored. It didn't save all of Port Marlow that night. It only kept a single pump and a single radio room running when nothing else could. That had always been exactly what Caleb built it to do. Inside the radio room, a young dispatcher kept relaying storm updates to two water rescue boats still out on the bay, never once losing the connection that Amelia's steady output made possible, and it wasn't until the rain eased toward dawn that anyone had the chance to stop and register what they had just watched happen. Nobody clapped, nobody cheered. The crowd simply stood in the wet grass in the gray early light, looking at a machine still running under a tarp of stars fading out overhead, and understood, without needing to be told twice, exactly what they had seen. The official results confirmed nearly 15% fuel savings, roughly 18% stronger low-end torque, continued operation after the primary sensor failed, no recurrence of misfire, temperatures held within safe limits throughout, and successful performance under a genuine load in heavy rain and humidity. When Caleb finally shut the engine down, the crowd stayed quiet. The men who had once called him a fool stood looking at the burned pistons displayed beside the running prototype, unable to say a word. Henry stepped forward and told the crowd that this wasn't the first time Caleb Mercer had solved a flaw in a Whittaker engine. It was only the first time nobody could erase his name from the result. Claire requested a formal session with the board, an independent attorney, the Product Safety Authority, and a certifying body. Clinton stood in front of that room and claimed Amelia relied on technology Caleb had developed while still employed at Whittaker, meaning the entire invention belonged to the company by right. The independent attorney separated the matter into two parts. The original thermal balancing principle had indeed been developed while Caleb was on Whittaker's payroll, giving the company certain licensing rights, but Caleb still had to be legally credited as the inventor, and erasing his name from that early work had itself been a violation. The components developed after he left, the adaptive secondary combustion chamber, the two-stage moisture separator, the mechanical backup governor, the modular housing, and the improved oil pathway, belonged entirely to Caleb. Claire laid out the evidence chain in order. The original report bearing Caleb's name, the later version bearing Clinton's, the signed design change order, the recall data matching Caleb's original warning, camera footage showing Kevin holding the sensor assembly far longer than his report claimed, the Whittaker calibration sticker, the internal alloy match on the altered timing wheel, the precise 4.5-degree shift machined with intent, the communications draft prepared before the failure occurred, and a message in which Clinton asked for an incident clear enough to end the project for good. Facing the weight of it, Kevin cooperated with investigators and admitted that Clinton had promised to erase his prior violation and promote him in exchange for making sure the prototype failed. He said Clinton had called it a controlled incident, nothing more than a way to end an inconvenient project cleanly, and that he hadn't let himself think too hard about what a misfire inside a fuel system could actually do if the cage failed to hold. He said it quietly, staring at the table rather than at Clinton, the kind of admission that comes only once a man has run out of better options. Clinton argued that the containment cage meant nobody had ever truly been in danger. Caleb answered that no one could guarantee a fuel system misfire would stay contained every single time. The board suspended Clinton pending a full investigation, and while the case would take months to resolve fully, he wasn't sentenced on the spot. Whittaker agreed to correct the inventor record, pay the royalties Caleb was owed, withdraw its objection to further testing, replace at-risk engines free of charge, submit to independent safety audits going forward, and compensate customers who had been affected by the earlier failures. Claire stood in front of the same room and publicly accepted her share of the blame for signing the legal letter before verifying the facts herself, refusing to let Clinton carry the entire weight alone. The certifying inspector who had stood beside the comparison engine all afternoon told a local reporter, off the record, that in 15 years of running equipment trials he had never seen a prototype hold up under an unscripted failure the way this one had, and that the industry had a habit of testing machines only for the conditions it expected, never for the ones that actually showed up. Investors approached Caleb afterward offering to buy the invention outright. He declined, choosing instead to license it under conditions he set himself. He retained control of the design, every future safety modification required independent approval, versions built for clinics and emergency responders would be priced lower, and a portion of the profits would fund training for mechanics who had lost their jobs elsewhere. When Clinton left the room for the last time, Caleb didn't mock him. He simply set the altered timing wheel down on the evidence table and let it speak for itself. 10 months later, Caleb opened Amelia Engine Works on the edge of Port Marlow, a modest operation rather than a sprawling factory. The adaptive module had been approved for use in fixed generators, industrial pumps, agricultural equipment, a pilot program for small service vessels, and off-road machinery, though broader approval would still require thousands of additional testing hours. Caleb wasn't in a hurry. He had already seen what happened when a company cut corners on safety just to move faster. The shop began with 9 employees. A middle-aged mechanic who had lost his job elsewhere, 2 veterans experienced with generator systems, a young technician who had never been able to afford college, a quality control specialist, and Patrick, who came on part-time to manage daily operations. Patrick's change of heart hadn't happened overnight. It had taken months of watching Caleb work before he was willing to admit, out loud, that he had misjudged him from the very beginning. Henry joined as a safety consultant, treating the role as a first step toward correcting old mistakes rather than as a way to erase them entirely. Claire was reinstated as chief executive once the investigation confirmed she had worked to stop a cover-up rather than participate in one, and she became a business partner in the venture without ever taking control of Amelia itself. Whatever existed between her and Caleb stayed understated, suggested only through an invitation to coffee after work, with no dramatic kiss, no proposal, and no rushed ending forced onto either of them. Grace appeared one final time, fastening a small nameplate onto the very first production module. It read simply, "Amelia built to keep going." Patrick carried in the first burned engine block, the one Caleb had originally begged him to save from the crusher, and asked, half joking, whether he wanted to finally sell it for scrap now that he could afford not to keep it. Caleb refused. He placed it in the training area instead. When one of the younger technicians asked why the shop still kept broken parts around when new equipment was easy enough to buy, Caleb picked up a burned piston and told him that new parts only show you what a machine looks like before life gets a chance to test it. Broken parts tell you exactly what it had to survive when nobody was watching. A truck loaded with the first 12 production modules pulled out of the yard that afternoon, bound for a coastal clinic and a rescue crew that had waited a long time for equipment they could trust. Caleb stood in the doorway of the shop and watched the truck turn out onto the coastal road, the same road he had walked home along 4 years earlier carrying a folder of hand-drawn schematics and nothing else to his name. Dale, the same mechanic who had once told him to sell his scrap pile for a better truck, stopped by that evening to ask about a job opening on the assembly line, and Caleb hired him without bringing up the past at all, because some debts were better settled through work than through words. Caleb Mercer never turned scrap metal into gold. What he did was take the failures other people had thrown away and use them to build a machine that refused to stop.